Lovely. Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to our Avery's virtual celebration of wine event. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Hopefully you're going to tune in every evening this week. Usually, for those of you who have been to past events, usually we would be doing our celebration of wine at the Bristol Grammar School this Saturday. But the idea of having 400 people in a room all spitting into the same bucket with winemakers flying in from all over the world didn't sound that appealing right now. But we are very happy and very glad that we are able to convert it into the online world. So over the next 4 nights, we are going to be hosting 2 masterclass sessions. Tonight we have the fantastic Mimi Avery. Give us a little wave, Mimi. And then later on at 8 o'clock, we have Rob Cameron from In Vivo Wines tuning in direct from New Zealand. It will be 8 a.m. their time. So I hope he's woken up. Tomorrow we will have Milan Chablis and Jeff Carrel from the Languedoc in France. On Friday we have Casa Silva from Chile and Von Bull from Pfalz in Germany. And then our final night on Saturday we have Castagno based in Ecula in Spain and Sovex Imports from Bordeaux. So do feel free any of those sessions, whether you have the wine or not, you can use those links that we sent out via the email to join any session that you like. It's a good chance to still feel involved in what would usually be our festival and a chance to meet our favorite winemakers and producers from around the world and learn a little bit more about wine. But yes, thank you very much everyone for joining. If you haven't done so already, do get the Cava out of the fridge and open up the Fine Red Burgundy for later. Pour yourself a nice glass of the Cava, and I think we are going to get started. Just to let you know, we are recording each of these sessions. So just for GDPR reasons, if you are not happy being on camera, please do turn your camera off. But it is also a good chance, if you don't hear anything that we mention, we will be uploading these onto YouTube in the next couple of days, so you can catch up with all the sessions there. Whilst at the moment everyone is on mute, we do still encourage lots of questions and debate and discussion about the wines. So please do use the chat function that myself and Louise will be monitoring throughout. Also, if you would like to ask any questions direct, then if you are using a computer or a laptop, you can just hold down the space bar and talk whilst you hold it down, and then you will unmute yourself to ask a question. But we will be encouraging you to get involved, and we'd like to hear what you guys think about the wines. And yeah, if you have any questions for Mimi or for Rob later on, then please do ask away. If you are joining both sessions, then you can stay on the same link. You don't need to go anywhere. We'll just continue. This one will go from 7 until 1:45, just in case there's a little bit of overrun or if there's any questions. We've got that 15-minute gap before Rob joins us at 8. So yeah, without further ado, over to you, Mimi.
Thank you very much. Oh, I've been spotlighted. So yes, Mimi Avery, Averys Wine Merchants, as you all know. And I am not hosting you from the lovely cellars where Frank is. I have a picture of it over my shoulder. That's the shop if you haven't been before. I know that we've got some people who are joining in who aren't from Bristol. So yes, I think it's one of Bristol's best kept secrets. But anyway, yes, welcome to COW, the Celebration of Wine 2020. So we were set up in 1793. There are going to be some pictures coming up, a PowerPoint. And yes, so in 1793, there was a wine merchant on the very spot that Frank is sat at the moment. This was had previously been a merchant, but in 1793, it was the first time that it was mentioned as being a wine merchant. And this was the spot where it's now been rebuilt, but I will explain more about that later. The wine in your glass, hopefully, is our Averys Cava. This is from the area of Valencia in Spain. Cava as a name comes from the caves, the cavas, where it is stored. And all cava needs to be stored for at least 9 months after it has been second fermented. Cava is made, this particular cava is made the method traditionnel, so the same way as champagne. Wine is put into a bottle along with some liqueur, so grape juice and some yeast, liqueur de tirage, and it is then capped up with a bottle, a sort of a beer bottle style cap, and left on its side for at least 9 months to mature and to get some of the flavours out from those lees, but also to create the bubbles that we all know and love in Cava. And it's the same style and method as you have in Champagne. The grapes that we use in Cava, in our Cava, are Paralada and Macabeo. There are other grape varieties that can be used, Zorello, another Spanish grape variety, but also they are producing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir grape varieties in order to make Champagne style Cava. The Paralada gives a lovely sort of quincy citrus note. I find that this has a certain level, almost honeyedness on it, and sort of slightly nutty, and it gives a sort of body, whereas the Macabeo is more exotic fruit, citrus, stone fruit, sort of waxy florals, almost sort of chamomile-ish. All Cava has to be between 10% alcohol and 13% alcohol, and this, as you can see, is 11.5. So it's a relatively light wine. I mean, only a couple of degrees, but it does make a bit of a difference. And it's a non-vintage. You can have vintage Cavas. This one is non-vintage. We do have a couple of vintage Cavas in the cellars and online for you to purchase. So yes, I think it's got this lovely sort of, not exactly rich. It's not quite as toasty as, say, Champagne, but it does have that complexity of having had the bottle age. There's with the yeast lying in the bottom of the bottle, you get this sort of extra complexity, this sort of toasty, buttery notes that aren't actually to do with oak. They're just to do with the yeast that's lying in the bottom bottle. Also behind Frank, you will see a Champagne. It's a triangular piece of wood, and the bottles go in horizontal to start with, and then they are remouaged. So they are twisted and lifted and twisted and lifted over the period of about a month, 2 months, until all the yeast is in the bottom. I won't turn my bottle upside down because it's half full of Cava. But when the bottle's that way up, all the yeast gets to the bottom, and then you put the bottles all with their neck down into glycerol, which freezes that little chunk, and then with a bit of a flourish you bring it up and you flick the top off and the ice cube flies out, and then you quickly put some dosage in, and dosage is what makes it anything from brut to dolce. This is a brut Cava, so it's only got about 3 grams per litre of sugar in it. And basically you flip it up, you get rid of the ice, you put a little bit of this cis reserva in, and then you put the proper cork in and cage it. And that will also keep pressure in the bottle. Champagne and Cava bottles are all designed to take up to 6 atmospheres of pressure, which is why they're heavier than normal bottles. And it's also why you have that cage on the top. So the Cava, any questions about the Cava? I can't hear it. Well, I can see Frank. Any questions, Frank? Louise?
No question. All I would say is I've used this on so many blind tastings up against Champagne, and it always confuses people thinking the quality of this wine is so much higher than the price tag that it actually is. On blind tastings, this does usually win up against a lot of Champagne. I think Champagne, whilst it is delicious, is not everyday drinking at the prices, whereas Cava is absolutely there for quality and value these days. And I think since the rise of Prosecco, Cava has seriously upped its game, and I think this is a cracking example.
Yeah, I'm a bit... Sorry, go on, Mimi.
I was just going to say, I see Mr. Purdon's asked a question about non-vintage and vintage, but Louise, you say you're...
I was just going to agree with Frank in terms of having Cava as something that is I don't want to say everyday drinking when it comes to sparkling wine, but for me, it definitely fits into that category of offering more kind of complexity and richness compared to a Prosecco, but often being at the same, if not cheaper, in terms of price. And they're really trying to up their perception of their quality. So seeing some really, really good, interesting producers doing great things with Cava, like you mentioned, with some of the champagne grape varieties. So if people have looked down their nose at Cava before, I think it's time to change opinions.
Yeah. So yeah, Mr. Purdon was asking the difference between vintage and non-vintage. So non-vintage champagne, Cava and champagne for that matter, is a blend of wines from different vintages, normally 2 or 3 different vintages, and sometimes in the liqueur de tirage, which is added before the second fermentation. You will add some older vintage wine along with, when you put the Sus Reserva in, you can also add a bit of older vintage wine as well, to give it a bit more complexity. Whereas vintage wine is purely 100% that vintage. It can make for a much more focused wine, but it's normally only made in the better vintages. And whereas if you can blend 2 or 3 vintages, you can get the different characters out of each vintage. And some vintages are a little bit leaner, which is great to add more acidity and freshness. And some are a little bit rounder and fuller, which again is great to give it more complexity.
You'll also find that the requirement on how long it has to stay in contact with that dead yeast after the fermentation is much longer when you're looking at vintage, both Cava and champagne.
Yeah.
So they tend to be a lot more intense, a lot more delicious, and sadly, a lot more expensive.
Yeah, there's a category as well that's come in quite recently, which you can look out for on bottles of Cava. This is my nerdiness coming through from having just done my sparkling wine exam, but it's called Cava Pauaje Calificado, and that's going to have 36 months of aging on the lees, as well as being having the vintage stated on the bottle. And that only comes in these dry styles that Mima was mentioning. You go right through to Dolce. That's only available in the Brut Nature, the Extra Brut, or Brut. So it's also got to be estate bottled and a lot of single vineyards and things. So when I say they're really pushing the quality levels up, that's definitely a good example. They only brought that in 3 or 4 years ago, really. So it's another thing to look out for on your bottle when you're looking at labelling. I could talk for more about so many facts in my brain, but back over to Mimi, I think. A little bit more about Averys.
So, Frank, where are we? Just starting at the beginning?
At the beginning.
Excellent. At the beginning. Well, this isn't quite the beginning. Frank is sat on the beginning. And then in the 1850s, the cellars that we now know of are were built because they were making Park Street, and Park Street didn't exist before the 1850s. And so over Frank's shoulder, if you point, Frank, to the Park Street wall, so one side of our cellars is actually the buttress wall of Park Street, and we are beneath the shops on Park Street. The picture that you can see under 1793, that was when we had our shop on the other side of Park Street, number 7. And again, that was actually rebuilt after the war, before the war, in the 1920s and 30s, because they were building the what we now know as City Hall and the Council House. And so that all got changed then. So the picture under 1793 is the footprint of the old shop and offices, which is now called the Mauritania, and had our number 1 and 2 warehouses in them, and 2 and 3 warehouses in them, and then Frank is sat in our number 1 bonded warehouse, which again has always been part of the business. And we also had cellars in Prothero's house, which is down just behind the theatre. And of course, it was very easy to get all the wine up from the harbour, where they would moor up on the promenade, which is of course now covered. And if they work, we've got those fountains in the middle of Bristol, but underneath those fountains are the original harbour and the River Frome. But they used to moor up the ships there and then roll the barrels up, and it was very easy to get them into this cellar and into the Prothero's house cellar. And yeah, we actually shared the cellaring during the Second World War with Harvey's, so that they could store their wines in a much more solid building at the time. So yes, they were our arch rivals, but very dear neighbours. So then after the 1850s, we then go to 1865. Yes, so the Bark Avery. My great-great-grandfather bought the Averys sort of space, as it were, and installed his brother, who was a rectifying distiller at the time, as the managing director of it. And he then went and bought a ship, and it sailed around the world in that era, and that has now become our logo. The lovely ship, you'll see it on a few of our bottles. It's in silver on the carvers, you'll see, and it's in red on the fine Burgundy. In the 1890s, we were focused on ports and sherries, and a little bit of German wine, and we were listed in the Bristol Port Association as being a supplier of fine ports and sherries to as far away as Penzance. So we're definitely West Country through and through. But as a lot of you know, we do sell wine. We do send wine further around the country. So then in 1923, my grandfather joins the business. Here you see him pictured in 1918. Actually, 2 years ago, I discovered a lovely lady wrote to me and said, I think I've got some letters that your grandfather wrote in the war. And he actually wrote a series of letters. He was only actually in the armed forces for a year and a half. So he turned 18 in the beginning of, the late 1917. So he only got to the front line about 3 or 4 months before the end of the war. And in his words, everyone gave up once he got to the front line. But yes, so we got some lovely letters from him. And anyway, he came back to England. He went to work in a wine merchant in London for a year to learn a little bit more about wine. And then he came down to Bristol to work with his uncle and his cousin. He was one of the first people to start traveling around visiting suppliers and visiting wine merchants. And he used to take his motor launch up the Gironde and moor it in Libourne and go and visit wine producers. And he would bring his own selections of Bordeaux, Burgundy and German wines in barrels and bottle it himself. And in some of our older, we've got price lists that go back to the 1930s, where in our lists of Bordeaux's and Burgundies, they sort of say Chateau bottled or Averys bottled. And there has been the odd tasting more recently where we've tried older bottlings, both Averys and French, and even the French tend to admit that ours are better, which mainly is because if you transport in bulk, it's a lot more delicate on the wine. And then if you bottle it here and then it doesn't move for 30 years, it's had a much more gentle life. And then of course the tastings were all held in England as well. So the wine that the French people brought over had been in their hold luggage all the way. Then in the 1930s, Ronald Avery went to the scrapping of the Mauretania. And in this picture, you see the dining room of the Mauretania ship. And this is how he put it into the Mauretania as we know it, number 7 Park Street. It's the building had quite a few rooms that had various different bits and pieces. There was a pillar room. To the right of this picture, there was the dancing hall, which had a big dome in it. It's still there now. And some of the Mauretania also went to Pinewood Studios, and the director's room in Pinewood Studios is full of is decked out in the paneling from the Mauretania. So from that moment onwards, the building was named the Mauretania. And again, anyone who's been to Bristol, the beautiful, if you can call a neon sign beautiful, but the beautiful neon sign on the side of number 7 Park Street was relit this time last year. It was quite difficult to get the new tubes done because basically it is a a visually moving version of the Mauritania on the high seas. And it was at the time the first ever moving neon sign in Bristol. But yes, I hope you're all still enjoying your Cava, by the way, because I can a bit like Louise can talk for Britain about wine, I can talk for Britain about the history of Averys.
I would also just say that I am actually sat on one of the chairs from the Mauritania on the desk.
Oh, the green velveteen.
Yeah, so they're still in use.
Yeah, and one of them actually, I don't know if this is the one that Frank sat at, still has chains underneath. So basically, they would chain each table to the floor so that they didn't slide around when the ship rocked from side to side. And yeah, we did wonder for a while what that was. Right, so in 1948, my grandfather comes back to the Gironde and is going up the river, and he moors up in Libourne as he had a want to do. And he actually is invited by the Seychelles to go and visit Chateau Palmer. And it's the first time that they've gone to visit the chateau after the war. And they went in, and the ground floor had been used as stables. So all the parquet flooring was completely ripped up by the horses' hooves. And it was literally just a stable. The next floor up was where the officers had their quarters, and was kept quite well. And then the top floor, they've actually locked it up and they never go in there now, and they've left it as a sort of memorial in a way. And that was where they used to have the Germans would have their parties. And there's a lot of graffiti and things on the walls, but they've left it as is. Now, I obviously haven't been to see there, and I don't believe that, I don't know how many people have seen it since, but I was told by John Salvi that where I was wondering whether it was a bit of a myth that my grandfather had gone and visited John, who was 7 years young, so who was about 40 years younger, was there in the garden having a picnic as a 7-year-old when my grandfather went in, and he said, yep, I remember it all, it definitely happened. So it's lovely when these sorts of stories do get proven correct to you. And the same goes for the 1949. So on another trip to France, my grandfather moored up, and he got in a taxi and asked the taxi driver to take him to Mouix. And the taxi driver sort of looked at him quizzically and in French asked him, sorry, where? And he said, Mouix. And the taxi driver got a bit exasperated. And anyway, ended up shutting the car door, driving to a roundabout just up the way, turning around, coming back and dropping him literally 100 yards from where he'd moored his boat. At this point in time, my grandfather's a little bit irate, but a man comes to the door of this place and sort of opens the door and sort of says, hello, do you want to come and taste some wine? And my grandfather sat there going, where am I? And he said, we're Mouix, JP Mouix. And so he goes in and he tastes the wines, and he basically had never really tasted any Pomerol wines beforehand. England knew about Saint-Emilion in that era, but Pomerol was a bit of an unknown region. And he tastes a load of Pomerols, quite likes them. And there's one that's quite expensive, but he thinks is definitely the best of the bunch. And so he comes back to England and he asks his friend, Harry Waugh, who works at Harvey's next door, if he'd be willing to sort of share a pallet of this wine and bring it over. And so they bring over 25 cases each. And the piece of paper that you can see is actually our log showing the importation of the 1949 Petrus in 1952. And it actually, there are still 2 cases left in 1970. It took a long time to sell quite an expensive wine that nobody'd ever heard of from a region that nobody knew. But, you know, somebody's got to go out there and somebody's got to pioneer it. And if any of you have ever heard of Chateau Petrus, the rest, as they say, is history.
It's now one of the most expensive wines in the world.
Yes. We have a few unlabeled half bottles at home that have a typewritten sticky label on them saying, believed to be Petrus 53. But who knows if it is or not. So then, yes, in 1959, we, as lots of people did, you'd have people coming around and working in the cellars and learning. I mean, even now we're counted as one of the best places to learn about wine. And so people come and work for us. And we had a few cellar rats over the years. which was our little nickname for them. Anyway, one of them was Wolf Blass, who turned up having just done his white winemaking degree in Germany. And he comes along and he learns to blend red wine with my grandfather. In the picture below, I don't know how many of you know him, but my father's on the left and Wolf is the slightly shorter gentleman. So he was with us for 2 years. And in fact, he showed me, this is the picture that when I went over to Australia to take my mum over to show her what Dad did 50 years beforehand. We did a 50-year celebration tour and we visited Wolf in Adelaide. And this is where he produced this picture that he'd literally taken off his wall in his house. And he came along and he also had photocopied 2 letters that had been written that gave him his permission to work in Australia. And one of them was from my grandfather, signed in 1961, to say, yes, this gentleman worked for me at Averys in England. And I thoroughly agree that he would make a great wine person in Australia. Let him in. And again, in the rest, as they say, is history. When we were in Australia, actually, we were told by a lot of the winemakers out there that one of the best things that Wolf did was, because his prowess was in his palate, is he didn't actually invest much in proper vineyards. He would go around and select wines from various vineyards and then do the blends himself and mature the wines. All this is actually written in his autobiography as well, which is lovely. He signed a couple of them for Mum and I when we were out there. But yeah, so he would go out there and source wines and then blend them together. And again, everyone that we saw out there said that he had the best palate in Australia for blending wines, which is lovely because he learnt from the person that the French think had the best palate in England, which was my grandfather. So yes, as you can see in that photograph, that is actually taken in 1969, when my father went out there and was judging on the same panel as Wolf Blass. So in 1960, Roland Ramussenet then comes over, and he makes a lot of Burgundy wine. He actually came over and started work as a sous chef in the Savoy. And as lots of sous chefs do, he ran out of money, and with his last little bit, he got a train to Bristol and turned up at Bristol train station and got hold of my grandmother and said, "Oi, I'm here. Can you help me?" So my grandmother and my grandfather sort of took him on board, and again, he became a cellarat, and he learnt a lot about wine from us. And then he went back to take over his family business, and we still sell Ramussenet wines now. Unfortunately, Roland passed away a couple of years ago. But yeah, we still have Ramussenet wines in the shop. And he was one of the people who took on board the fact that we would take excess stock that you can't bottle as what it says, as what it actually is, because you're only allowed to produce a certain volume per hectare in a vineyard. And his range for us in Burgundy was called Renommé, renamed. But yeah, so we've had a few. I mean, we had Robert Hill-Smith from Yolumba came over and worked in the cellar. And yes, as Louise has just put up on the chat, we've got a fair amount on our social media giving you the history of our cellarats. So wine number 2, if you're not all too thirsty, having just had the Cava. It's the Averys Red Burgundy. Any questions on the history up until 1960?
I think it's just quite an important fact of that your grandfather was one of the first people to actually source wines direct, and that's just commonplace these days, that people just don't even realize that when that really started.
Yeah.
So yeah, big pioneer on that front, certainly.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean there were basically just agents around, and you had to trust the agent that they were bringing over the wines in a healthy manner, and not leaving them in the ports for ages, but also that whether they were bottled abroad or in the UK. You know, there's bottle variations and everything. And if you're dealing with agents, I suppose you have to trust the agents. And I mean, we became agents, so you know, I can't say that all agents are bad. That's absolutely not true. And I don't think they were all bad then. But I think in order to source the wines that he wanted to be able to show to his customers, he very much valued going out there and meeting them himself. And there was one story of and I don't know which producer in Burgundy it was, but he was offered more money for his wines, and he actually said to my grandfather, he said, look, you know, I know you, I trust you, and I know that you look after my wines when you take them from me, and that when they get you store them in your cellars where Frank is, and you sell them when they're ready to be drunk, and I appreciate that, and I think it makes a lot of difference. Whereas if you just sell the wine straight away from the minute they've landed, they quite often have a thing called bottle shock, which was probably even worse then. Now at least our lorries have suspension and things. But yes, so the wines can be quite closed, and then you want to leave them and let them mature, and then drink them when they're absolutely ready. So yes, the Averys Red Burgundy. This is made for us by the lovely Vincent Prunier. The 2017 is the second vintage that we took from him. Yes, it's from France, as you can see from the slide, and it is from just below Beaune, so above Mâcon and below Beaune, the Côte de Beaune area. Vincent has vineyards and is based in Aussy-Duresse, but he also has plantings in various other areas of the Côte de Beaune and in Chassagne-Montrachet, which, like Pouligny-Montrachet, actually they do produce a little bit of red wine. Obviously, they're incredibly famous for their white wines, but they do produce some red wines. And this wine is, as I say, it's mainly it's got a fair chunk of Aussy-Duresse in, but it also has sort of younger vine or excess production Chassagne-Montrachet, and it has other vineyards from the Côte de Beaune blended in with it to give it this lovely sort of soft, juicy, ripe and sort of slightly spicy raspberry aromas and flavors. Pinot Noir is a tricky grape. It is grown all over the world now, but it does actually seem to produce its best wines when it is in an area where it is being sort of more stressed. It can be quite jammy and rich, and ripe, and a very different sort of wine if you get it from Oregon or in America, or Otago in South Island, New Zealand, or South Africa. Hamilton Russell produces a very nice one from there, but they are really quite different, even though they're sort of trying to get that elegance of Burgundy. They are quite different. And I mean, a rich, ripe vintage from Burgundy can produce quite a sort of fruit compote style of wine. But yes, so here you've got a lovely sort of savoury note to it, a hint of garriguey spice, so a little bit like sort of heathery and sagey on the nose. And then on the palate, it's got just right raspberries and red cherry, and a sort of a juiciness, but there's a lovely acidity running through it as well. You can get that on the tongue, and there's some good fruit tannins and oak tannins. It's not overly oaked, but there is a lovely sort of toasty butteriness to it that really sort of softens it all out. I mean, it's only 3 years old now. It will go on another 3, 4, 5 years at least, and will just sort of soften out and become a little bit more savoury as it develops, and it will lose more of those primary fruit characteristics that you get, and that's interesting. I would say that this has definitely got another couple of years left in it, but well read. I will double check when we put the next vintage out. But yes, 2017 should definitely last 5 years from then. So we've got another 2-3 years left. But on the other hand, it's each to his own. The English are notorious for drinking their wines more mature than the French. The French like them younger and fresher, and the English prefer them getting these savoury characteristics. That is a big generalisation, but each to his own. If you think it's tasting brilliantly now, then carry on drinking it now. If you think you would like to try it when it's getting sort of more mature, then obviously leave it for a little while. With our champagne, for example, a lot of people buy our champagne and then stick it under the stairs for 6 to 12 months and let it mature a bit more, because it develops more characteristics, more sort of biscuity notes. And lots of wines do benefit from aging, either in your cellar or under the bed in the spare room if you haven't got a cellar, and just keep the heating off, and make sure it's in an area, or in the back of the garage if you've got a nice sort of fairly solidly built garage, somewhere where the temperatures won't change very much, and humidity and light won't change very much either. The fine red Burgundy, it won't throw a sediment, but obviously you can decant in order to make it taste more mature at that point in time. You can decant it and leave it for a couple of hours before, and almost every red wine benefits from decanting and a bit of aeration. It just allows all those aromas and flavors to sort of meld a bit more and to come out, and it's always good to give it a bit of air, and don't do what I did, which is I accidentally stuck it in the fridge. Sorry, but it's nice. It's nicely warmed up now in my house, in my flat, since I took it out about an hour ago. But having said that, in the summer, I don't think there's any problem with putting some red wines in the fridge. Beaujolais and some Italian, lighter style Italian wines, Montepulcianos, do actually do quite well in the fridge, and come out tasting much more sort of fresh and vibrant. But yes.
I think this is delicious. I just think it's delicious. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Pinot Noir anyway, and to find affordable Pinot Noir, as you said, it's notoriously a difficult grape variety to grow, and finding Pinot Noir at sensible pricing is hard to find. And I think this is delicious, already showing a little bit of that maturity, but just that gentle savory note on the finish, like sort of almost earthy and mushroom characteristics. But I think that's going to mature quite nicely over a few more years. I think it's delicious.
Yeah, unfortunately we can't change the back label, but we'll just tell everybody.
Okay, let's.
Was there any more questions?
Lovely. Let's crack on then.
Okay, so now we get into the era of my father. And I just mentioned our champagne. So in 1963, it was the first vintage of our Averys Special Cuvée made by Boiselle. There was an Averys Special Cuvée beforehand. Unfortunately, I have no idea who made it. But Christian Roch Boiselle, pictured as you can see, remembers his first job, having married Madame Boiselle, was to come over to England and talk to people that they supplied. And one of his trips, the first trip, was to come down to Bristol and see my grandfather and discuss the blend for Averys Special Cuvée. Now, champagne is generally made from 3 grape varieties and different proportions of all of them. It'll be Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. There are various clones of all 3 of those grape varieties. There's one that's used in England called Pinot Precoce, because it is a little bit precocious and therefore ripens early, and therefore Hattingley Valley love it and can use it in their sparkling English wine. But we have basically a third of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. The Chardonnay produces sort of appley notes. The Pinot Noir produces these raspberry notes, a bit like you get in the Burgundy. And then the Pinot Meunier is a grape variety that the French don't use that much because A, it ripens early, and B, it matures quite quickly in the blend. So they would rather use less of it, whereas my grandfather wanted to use more, because if he used a third Pinot Meunier, it would develop these sort of aged characteristics of brioche and biscuit and nuttiness, which he loved because it made it seem like an older vintage champagne than a relatively young non-vintage. It was just a style that did very well for us then, and to this day it's our single best-selling product at Averys. And as I said beforehand, people will buy it and then lay it down for 6 months to a year in order for it to develop those flavors and to settle a bit from having traveled across from France to England. But yeah, so that's one of the companies that we've been working with for ages. And in fact, Von Buell, who are doing the tasting on Friday. They were in our price list back in 1933. I am not sure how long before then we worked with them, but I'm sure it was before that. But certainly in 1933, it's in print that we were working with Von Buell. And Taylor's have told us that we've been working with them since the turn of the century, but the turn of the last century. Gosh, how time flies. So yes. And then, as I said beforehand, so my father did a bit of travel. He was at university till 1965. And in 1964, he did his summer out traveling to America. And he visited Davis, California University, and ended up doing a piece, a piece for his university degree in England on the marketing, packaging, and selling of Californian wines. So while he was out there, he discovered that they were actually holding their best wines back for themselves. Now, admittedly, that America's quite big; they can drink it all without exporting it. But he said to them, why send us some of your wines? It's amazing. We want to sell it. And they said, well, why would we send it all the way over to England? We have no idea what's going to go wrong in the transportation. We don't know what's going to go wrong when it's sold in England. We don't know who you're going to sell it to. Why would we risk it when we can sell it all over here? And Dad said, look, come on, try. And so we became the first importers, agents for fine Californian wines, Montelima, Beaulieu, further down the line, Ridge. And yes, my dad was very pleased that he was able to bring those wines to England. I mean, they weren't exactly cheap, but they were very good quality, and it did show a completely different side to American wines from things like Two Buck Chuck. Then in 1965, he'd come across, he'd been told about Australian wines by a friend in the university wine team at Oxford. And so he went to visit his friend in Australia, and Mike McKellar, who went on to be an MP in Australia. And he decided on the airplane on the way over that he was going to sort of give himself a title of export manager. And we were already selling wines to people in Australia. We were selling wines to people in Nassau. We were selling wines all around the world, most of it being delivered by ship everywhere. It was quite incredible. But yeah, so we were already selling wines to Australia. So he went to visit the people that he sold wine to. But at the same time, he was visiting vineyards and tasting their wines, and realizing that he was there just as they were beginning to change from everything being fortified, ports and sherries, or at least their versions of, into table wine. And so in 1966, he becomes the first person in England to bring Australian wines to the UK. And we were the first agents for McWilliams. He only bought 10 cases of Penfolds Grange over. But again, that's what they let him have. That was their little pièce de résistance. And in fact, the first vintage ever of Grange was in 52, and it was done secretly by the winemaker. But by 1966, he was producing it non-secretly, and everyone knew that it was a very good wine. So yes, he was met at the airport by a journalist, because in that era, there was travel, but not a lot of travel by aeroplane. In fact, in 65 was the first year that the England cricket team travelled to Australia by plane. They'd always gone by the boats beforehand. And so there were journalists quite regularly in the airports, and he was accosted by this lovely young girl, and she asked him, what did he think of Australian wine? And he said, I've tasted very little. and it was frightful. But yes, he then did, when he got to his hotel, a week later, he'd been found by various wine people in Australia, and Len Evans and the like, made sure he tasted some wines. He got to join the Thursday Bottle Club, where they were showing each other wines, the Tyrrells, Dr. Healy, and as I say, Len Evans, Max Lake, various people like that from Lakes Folly. And so he wrote a letter back to the Sydney Morning Herald and said, yes, sorry that I said I hadn't tasted any good wines yet, but I have now tasted lots of lovely wines. Yeah, there are some nice wines in Australia. So yes. Then in 1966, so my grandfather flies over at the end of 65 to follow the cricket, as it happens, and they go and play a match in New Zealand. So my grandfather and my dad go to New Zealand, and they taste a bit of wine there, but there is so little wine that it's quite tricky. But he meets the right people, and he ends up being a head judge at the Wines of New Zealand judging. He's the first non-New Zealander to be judging there, and in Australia he's the first non-Australian to be judging in their competitions. And so yes, in the 70s he becomes the first person to bring New Zealand wines to the UK. And an aside, given what's going to come next, that leads us neatly on, but I'll just nip back to Australia. So in 1973, very few wines had grape varieties on the label. And you can't really see, but in the McWilliams boxes, they're actually labelled Hermitage and Sauterne, as opposed to the grape varieties that are in them. But so instead of calling Tyrrells calling their Chardonnay a Burgundy, which it was known as, they're the first people to put Chardonnay on the bottle. And it's a great thing at the time, but it's a little bit like lots of things. There's a good, bad, and a good side to it and a bad side to it. And so ultimately ABC was born out of the fact that everyone knew what Australian Chardonnay was like, and the fact that it got oakier and oakier and oakier for a while. And unfortunately that wasn't necessarily what everyone liked. And they're now a little bit more restrained, but yes. So that's the dad bit in a nutshell. Any more questions?
There's a couple in the chat, Mimi, if you don't mind picking up, just regarding the own label wine. So when we put wine under our own label, do we just take the stock in one go, or are we kind of agreeing it over several vintages?
We tend to agree it over, I mean, it's not exactly a sort of an absolute, but basically we go to a supplier that we know makes wines that we think are classic for their region, and stylistically what we want, what we think our customers are going to want. And so we work with them. And for example, Remoissenet did make our own label Burgundy for 10 or 15 years. But then things changed and we moved to Vincent Prunier because we liked his style, and I suspect his price point. So, you know, we don't try and change every year, but, you know, sometimes you have to, or needs must, or things like that. But for example, our Averys Alsace, which is my little baby, I blended that the year of T5, Terminal 5 opening, and I didn't quite get stuck over there, but it was a very odd day, shall we say. I was only in Alsace for 24 hours, but I blended it at Cave de Hunevere. We since went to a lovely family called Gisselbrecht, but actually we've now gone back to Cave de Hunevere with this vintage, because different vintages produce different wines, and much as you'd like to be able to stay with everybody all the time, there are reasons behind going for different producers.
And I think just in addition for that question, in terms of buying the kind of the wine from the winery, I don't know if they're insinuating in the question, do we ship it all over in one go, or is it kind of held in the winery for us?
Oh, right. Yeah, so
that side of things.
I mean, for example, our champagne, they disgorge our champagne 6 months before we ship it. We ask them to do that so that it gets a bit more bottle age. So it gets a bit more bottle age than it might do if it was disgorge and then sent instantly. We will have reservations on wines to cover a year, and before that's run out, we will be tasting the next vintage and working out what we want to do. And so, yeah, sometimes wine is held on a reservation, and we don't really have the warehouse space to ship a year's worth of wine in one go. We try and sort of be sort of 3 to 6 months supply. I can't actually see the question, so if you...
No, that's okay. I can read them out to you. There's another interesting one. A couple of people have asked about the next big discovery, or maybe in terms of what Averys might introduce to the wine world, or just in general, what countries are starting to impress you, and also what are you kind of looking for that's exciting and new?
Well, I was very lucky. Well, not very lucky. I decided to go on a trip that was organised by the West of England Wine and Spirit Association to Moldova 2 Octobers ago. And that was really, really interesting. I mean, as a country, it's very Soviet looking. There are still a lot of big, square, grey block buildings. But wine styles, they were actually doing quite a lot of noble grapes, so Chardonnays, Cabernets, Merlots. But I was most impressed by the wines that they have, the Fetasca Negra, Fetasca d'Alba. They're local grape varieties. They're the only two I can pronounce, sorry. Although, and yes, so we've just taken on because of our links, our buyer has got us a wonderful Grašvina from Croatia. So I think Central Europe is really coming into its own again. I mean, I was a bit too young, but I know Bulgarian wine was loved in the 70s and 80s. And then for all sorts of reasons, it sort of disappeared off the marketplace. But the whole of sort of Central European wines are coming back again now. And I think a lot is done with travel. You know, the more people travel, the more people discover, and the more people are willing to experiment because they've tasted them further away. So when New Zealand wines came in, you know, not many people went to New Zealand in the 70s and 60s. So you wouldn't come back going, oh, my favorite wine is. Whereas now, you know, people are doing that more experimental travel, and they're finding wines. Greek wine, amazing. We've got Nero and a couple of, no, not Nero.
Assertico.
Yeah, the Assertico and the Agorgitico. So Assertico is assertive, which makes it a woman. And Agorgitico has George in it, which makes it man. So it's white wine Assertico, red wine Agorgitico. And I'm sure I'm probably not allowed to say that anymore, but that's the way I remember it. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen.
We are actually using the Assertico on our next monthly tasting at the end of the month on the 25th. Just for
quick, everyone sign up.
Thank you, Mimi. What would you say is your favourite region, though, Mimi?
Well,
area that stands out.
So I have heard it does go through other people in the wine trade, but I'm not sure it gets very much beyond the wine trade. But because I was born in a vintage that was very good for Burgundy, I do like Burgundy because it was brought out at every birthday of mine. My vintage Burgundy. So, you know, it's almost drilled into you that sort of unbeknownst to me that was going to be my favorite. My brother's born in a Bordeaux vintage. His favorite wine is Bordeaux. My twin sisters are born in a port vintage. Their favorite wine is sweet. I am also lucky I get a champagne vintage too, which was lovely. I have to say the last time I tasted it, though, it was a little bit mature now. Don't leave champagne for more than 40 years. 30 is okay, but 40 is just a bit stretching it.
Was that a non-vintage?
No, that was a vintage.
Okay. And would you say there's any particular producers that you were proud to bring into the Averys range when you were doing some of the buying?
Well, so you've got my little favourite coming on next, In Vivo, and they're brilliant. They do an own label wine for us that you'll see, and we were the first people that they did that for, but they'll tell you what's happened since. I did love going to Cave de Henneville and making the Alsace because that was the first time I'd actually blended a wine. Properly sat there with the winemaker and blended it. And when we came back to England, I came back with the winemaker's original blend, my blend, and a blend that we thought could be interesting, but we weren't quite sure about it. And everyone who blind tasted it in the buying team chose mine. So that was lovely. And we're still doing this. So I can't remember the year that T5 happened, but I think it's at least 10 years ago. And we are still doing that wine now, which is lovely. I also, Portugal. My dad always said, "Oh, I can't believe you're buying Portugal. There's nothing good." He actually said to me, "There's nothing good in Portugal 15 years ago," and I proved him wrong. But I've met some wonderful Portuguese people, and our Atlantico is a lovely red, white, and rosé, entry level, nice sort of party wine, good summertime wine. But I did like bringing that in.